In this video, we're going to look at rhythm, and more specifically, a rhythm tree. Now, rhythm is actually the beat or the amalgamation of notes that we see when we listen to music or when we hear when we listen to music. A rhythm tree is a holistic approach of understanding all of the rhythms and how to find a specific rhythm. Kind of gives you an overview or a global approach to rhythm. Now, typically when we talk about rhythm, we want to start with a whole note. For our context here, let's say that a whole note is going to be equaled to 4 beats. Now, this whole note is much like a pizza or a pie, whereas if we were to cut it in half, we would have 2 halves that both equal 2. So this is kind of like in mathematics when we have fractions. Now, if we cut that whole note in half, the next rhythm down in our rhythm tree would be a half note. And of course, I'm going to put 2 half notes to equal our whole note. But each of those half notes equals 2 beats. So 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, if we were to cut a half note in half again, we get what's called a quarter note, and that's pretty self-explanatory in terms of cutting a whole note in half, you get a half note. And then if you cut a half in half again, you get a quarter note, right? Now, our quarter note typically gets 1 beat. If we were to then go even further, we can cut a quarter note in half, and we would get an 8th note. Now, let me draw it a different way. The 8th note could be drawn 2 different ways. It can be drawn like this, as a separate 8th note, or you can draw 2 8th notes together and beam them like that. Either way, you have to get a total of 8 8th notes at this level to equal your whole note. Now, if you were to divide 1 8th note in half, you would get a 16th note. If you were to divide the 8th note in half, you would get 2 16th notes. Now, the 16th note has 2 beams like that. Just like the 8th note has 1 beam, or 1 tail rather, the 16th note has 2. And in order to get all of these notes written out, you would need to double your 8 8th notes. So you would need 16 16th notes to equal out to your whole note. Now, you can divide even further down the rhythm tree, and if you put 3 flags, then instead of 16th notes, we would double that value, which is a 32nd note. And of course, if we add a 4th flag, we would double the value again, and we would get 1 64th note. Now, typically, this is around where it stops. I have seen some scores that have 128th note. So 1, 2, 3, 4, that have 5 little flags. But by and large, those are pretty rare. In fact, most music stops around a 16th note pulse. And the reason for that is because after a 16th note, it becomes a little bit too complex and too hard to read for the average musician. So what a composer can do is actually speed up the tempo. And by doing that, you can use slower notes. So let's say if, for example, you had a tempo at 60 and you were using a whole note, or let's say a quarter note, if you double the tempo to 120, then you can actually start using slower notes like half notes, and they would represent what the quarter note in the previous tempo was. So if you want to use 128th notes or 164th notes, instead of actually just writing that, all you have to do is double the tempo, so go from 60 to 120, and then you can use the next level up. So instead of using 8th notes, you would use all quarter notes. Instead of using quarter notes, you would use half notes, and so forth. So that's one way to get around having to use 128th notes and 64th notes. And again, it's just to be friendly to the musicians, because if you're writing a piece of music that's too difficult, oftentimes it becomes unplayable once it gets too fast at 164th note or 128th note. And therefore, if it's too fast to play, it's too difficult, you're not going to get a good performance, and ultimately you're not going to get a good recording, and the piece is just going to fall apart, and the musicians are not going to enjoy playing your music, so they're probably not going to want to play it again. So we want to make it as friendly as we can. Overall, this is what we're calling the rhythm tree, and if you can memorize how to do this, then it'll help you to figure out how the rhythms are all related and interconnected. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know if you have any questions.